Okay, so I am very privileged to be sat with these three panelists because over the last year and a half, I have discovered that they are very knowledgeable on the security space, security token space. Well, at least more than most people I speak with. Don't want to embarrass anyone. But it's obviously a very big theme. It's something that we still don't have a lot of clarity on from a lot of jurisdictions. But it's obviously a part of our assumption in the future that security tokens will be tradable in a more easy fashion. And so I wanted to organize this panel because I'd really like to try and get some insights and perspectives onto how this might be possible in future. So on the panel, I'm going to let them introduce themselves maybe for a minute, but we've got two different types of perspectives. We've got Bank Frick and Crypto Fund who deal in crypto, but in a slightly more traditional way. And then Sebastian, who is implementing security tokens from a more technical perspective. And I'd like, maybe in your introductions, you can just talk a little bit about what your day-to-day experiences, if any, or thought processes with security tokens. Sebastian, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm Sebastian, co-founder and CTO of Validity Labs. We started in this space about 3 years ago, starting educating people what blockchain is and what smart contracts is. And one of the things that we came across when implementing blockchain-based projects for our client is that at some point we started not just having these crazy ICO tokens that we were sometimes relatively unsure about what is even the underlying, but going into a more traditional space, right? And this has been something that interestingly people criticized us for, like from the crypto space, saying, hey, you're just working with the banks and stuff, like this is just boring old stuff, right? And at the same time, from like working with a number of these large law firms that we work with, we had a little bit the signal that there's a lot of unclarity, like how do you even do that? Can you transfer shares on a blockchain today? Like how does it even work?
So we're going to come back to that. Thank you.
So, but that's some of the things that we see in practice and where we have to find solutions today when coding, because in coding you have to find answers, right?
Yeah.
So my name is Matthias Brauer. I'm working for Crypto Fund AG. We are kind of probably the most traditional crypto fund asset manager that you see in the space, in the sense of like the setup that we have is very traditional. And I see the security thing mostly at the moment from the client side, because I think this is the kind of tokens that they most can like get a feeling for it, that's most familiar to them. And I could imagine that the broad adoption is really coming then when more security tokens are available, because that's what the investor side is really comfortable kind of
evaluating.
Yeah.
Rafi? All right. So I'm the banker here. My name is Raphael. I'm heading the funds and products team at Bank Frick. Most of you might know that we are dealing quite a bit with crypto assets. We started like 3 years ago to really generate an interest into that area. On the other side, I'm a member of the executive board at MAMA and also a board member of 21st Finance, which is a primary market issuance platform to be launched soon.
Awesome. So I want to kick off with a question to Matthias and Rafi. Within your organizations today, are you able to trade tokenized securities?
Yes and no.
Can you explain? Like if no, why no?
Yeah. So basically, I think it is very important to make a distinction between primary market and secondary market. So while in a primary market, things like AML, KYC is an important issue. I think that is not an interesting news for you guys, but this can be done. So we have guys like Sebastian, they're building up great technology to ensure that KYC, AML is done. You work with the smart contracts. You basically embed each and every regulation into that. So that we can do, and we have some cases, live cases we're working on. On the other side, if you switch to the secondary market, there is just a whole bunch of regulation you have to respect. So just giving you one example, MiFID. That's kind of, or likely the worst word that we have heard the past few years. The thing is, I mean, you got to make sure So nowadays, a bank has to make sure that an investor is suitable for a specific product. And I'm not saying that a bank, I mean, to be very honest, that just keeps investors away from doing the investments they want to do. Since a large number of banks, or most banks, are struggling with all the liabilities they have due to that, and they keep investors away from exotic investments. So for example, let's say Melonport raised some monies, that would have been an exotic investment because it's not traded on a secondary market. And just to make a long story short, primary market, yes, secondary market, soon, I hope.
Okay, I'll come back to this soon in a bit. Matthias?
Yeah, for us it's basically, yes, we could, but we don't do at the moment yet.
But in terms of licenses, etc., you have everything?
Well, we have several companies in the group, right? So for the asset manager, yes, obviously we could, but on the brokerage side, we are working on the securities dealer license in Switzerland that actually.
Which would enable that, yeah.
yeah.
Which I heard is one of the hardest licenses to obtain, actually. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, that's true.
I mean, just to clarify that, I think Matthias and myself were kind of in a different position. So he's acting as an asset manager, so of course he can buy security token, and I'm quite sure these guys know exactly what they want to buy and whatnot. And myself, as let's say with my bank freak hat on, there is a bit of a different situation. So I'm going to be the one to make sure that all these reportings are done to the national regulators, and I'm the one to check whether Matthias is suitable to do that investment or not. It's a bit of a difference.
Yeah.
Okay, and Sebastian, maybe given, I mean, you're sitting in quite a fascinating seat trying to implement the security tokens in a regulatory compliant manner. Presumably, I'm more interested in the secondary market side of things. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the features you've had to implement or you're thinking about implementing to make these secondary trading, these tokens tradable on secondary markets without too much concern.
Yeah, basically what we have seen, I would say, over the last 2 years has been pretty wild, to say the least. Also, when you talk to lawyers and as a developer, you need a binary answer, right? You need to know if you build it this way or that way. And if you talk to different lawyers and different law firms, you sometimes get very different impressions of what we should build. And we don't have the lead in that. But what I've seen is that people just, distribute. Let's say that was some example from 2017. People distribute a token. They didn't call it a security, and it has a feature that's called airdrop. But if you look at it, what this airdrop actually meant, it was a dividend, right? So it was not called a security token back then, but that is one of the things that we now actually see more and more being built in, saying, what can we actually improve on the status quo, and how can we make the world a little bit more efficient by trading it through smart contracts and having automated settlement on the blockchain and via smart contracts. So a dividend mechanism is for example, one. Then I think there's a big misunderstanding in the world out there, probably not in this room, on what you can and cannot do on a blockchain. So specifically to your question on tradability, right? So people think there's this big wild blockchain that allows all sorts of parties to buy tokens, but that's not necessarily the case. So we have also had instances where we did build security tokens, which, for example, required, even though I didn't like it, but did require whitelisting of addresses, right? So you can only receive a token if you have been passing KYC or AML checks, and that is possible on public blockchains today, right? And maybe another thing is like what we call forced transfer, right? So it should be possible to confiscate funds. So even on these wild public blockchains, yes, that is very much possible, right? It's not pretty, and it does have, severe limitations on the trustlessness of DEXs, for example. I can steal money out of a DEX if I want to as the issuer, right? But this is some things that we have seen as a legal requirement to us as the people building that stuff to really bake into a token. And it is possible, again, on the public blockchain, it is possible to make that compliant with the ERC20 standard, for example.
Within the current legal framework, you can make it compliant.
That's not a question for me to answer, but we have certainly built it like that, yeah.
I've had a quick look at the current legal requirements, and I think they're terribly suited for a tokenized form of a security, like really awful. It's, almost there's no point of having the efficiency of a token if you're going to go through all of those steps. And we recently had I've mentioned this report a few times now in the last 48 hours, but the Swiss Federal Blockchain report was very helpful in referencing securities. And I think one of the nice things about the report is that they did address the transfer of tokens and possibly even admitted, in fact, they did admit that the current existing legal framework for securities is not quite amenable to tokens. If you had an hour or 5 minutes with the authors of that paper, what would you say to them where they can sort of achieve the goals of protecting ultimately what they care about is protecting the investor? I think that's ultimately what most of the law boils down to when it comes to securities. What would you say to them as a suggestion?
There's a second aspect that I think is admittedly important, right? And the regulator also has some sort of stability requirements, right, to ensure that this ecosystem we live in fulfill certain stability requirements. So for example, if somebody was to try to trade something crazy like some $10 trillion assets on a public blockchain today, I would say, hey, let's maybe not do that just yet, right? But I would say one approach that I've seen work really quite well in different areas of fintech is if we have sandbox approaches, right? If we have some easy ways that are not impacting kind of the financial ecosystem at a larger scale, let us experiment with that stuff. So please let us try these new innovative things. Let us not get regulation into fostering the position of rent seekers, right? I find the word intermediary not strong enough. It is rent seekers that are the problem, that extract value of something that is created by entrepreneurs as a public good, right? So let us experiment with tokenized securities of like small cap enterprise, and let's see where this takes us. My claim is it can take us orders of magnitude, not just in efficiencies into a new world, but into new things. Like people, how do people trade securities today? I think how people trade securities today will fundamentally change if I don't have to pay 20 francs per trade in a first world country like Switzerland, and if this thing doesn't close at 5 p.m. I mean, has anybody of you ever been to Amazon and Amazon closed at 5 p.m.? Well, that's happening today, right? That's how it looks like today, and if we change that in a small environment, I think we're going to see a very new world of securities trading, and I'm very excited about that on a small scale.
Matthias, if you had your 5 minutes with the authors of the paper, what would you propose?
I would propose that, the sandboxes is a very good example how to try things out, right? And what I see in Switzerland is kind of like they were very liberal in the space in the beginning, then they got overcrowded by their own liberality, then they had to go back forth a little bit, the FINMA, especially on the ICO topic. I would say this year probably the biggest topic in my view will be the storage topic. What considers storage of tokens, of coins? In which form is it regulated or not? And I think this is very important that these questions get solved pretty fast. Because it's basically holding back a lot of projects because they don't know can they do it or how they have to do it. So I think this is the most important point for me at that stage to be solved.
Yeah. Rath?
Well, from my point of view, different messages to different jurisdictions or regulators. So myself, I'm Swiss. I'm working in Liechtenstein for quite a while. So in terms of Liechtenstein, I would say keep going. That's the message that I had. So honestly, we really can't complain. We're having talks. We're having regular talks to them. They really built up knowledge. So this is the message that I had for all the other regulators: is build up knowledge. So find out where the potential is. As Sebastian said, clearing as it works today is just, I don't want to see that in 5 years' time anymore. So I came my way from the back office operations in a bank, so I did a banking apprenticeship back then, and we were taught processes, and really, somehow maybe I can compare that to Mona's background. You're just dealing with things, you just don't understand them, why that has to be so complicated. And when blockchain popped up, my first impression was that this is gonna change a whole load of things. So yeah, build up knowledge, find ways to embed this technology into the regulation. And I think this is what we are doing in Liechtenstein and what most of other regulators are likely to do soon. And yeah, in case of Europe, of course, there is a European umbrella over it. So they released a very interesting paper on the 9th of Jan. So for everyone who wants to read it, it is very dry, but very informative. So.
Is that the ESMA paper?
Yes.
Or? Yeah. Okay. So I had a question. My understanding, but I might be wrong. I'm no legal expert. If I own a security token and I want to sell it to Sebastian, this is a peer-to-peer securities transfer. According to the existing law, if we entered into that transaction, would we be breaching the law? Given there's no intermediary or no licenses held by either of us?
You certainly wouldn't breach the law, since that is not considered to be a trade that is done on a secondary market, on a regulated market. So that's an OTC deal. You can certainly do that. But what you have to make sure is that stamp duty is paid, which is a 15 basis point tax you have to pay. So that is a question in a future environment. So nowadays you got Bank A, Bank B, you got a clearing system. So each and every one has its duties. You make sure taxes are paid on transactions. You make sure reportings are released. You make sure that this and that is done. I'm not saying that banks have to do that in the future, but I'm saying that this specific transaction would require someone to do that.
Got it. Okay. I asked the question because when reading the Swiss blockchain report, which I think is a great reference because it's so forward-looking on decentralized technologies, it mentions that if you're operating a peer-to-peer trading platform, that you need the required licenses. To me, I see a peer-to-peer trading platform similar to me selling something to Sebastian. So this seemed a little bit excessive, given that. Do you have any ideas or thoughts on that? Do you agree with this requirement? Do you think it's possible it would change in future?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to ask a techie this hard legal questions, right? But my attempt is, what are we trying to protect today, and what does it translate into tomorrow? Because this sort of OTC deals versus marketplaces, many of the regulations of marketplaces have this kind of, embedded in it, this vision, or as a kind of God-given entity of this central rent seeker that sits there and can do bad things. Well, if we can build systems that don't require this thing in the middle there to be able to even do bad things, do we need to really employ the same kind of drastic measures on securing that? And I think definitely not, right? Crypto is not made so that people can raise $100 million in 10 minutes. Crypto is made so that we don't have to trust the central party, right? So let's just not try to hammer this security law on top of it. Let's try to build a system that is working like from the ground up.
I saw an eyebrow go up there, so I think Matthias has something to say.
No? Maybe there is something that I could add. So I basically understand the idea. This liberal idea of blockchain, etc. So, but in terms of taxes, for example, or whatever you do on a blockchain. So in the end, and as you said, there are just a few things you want to make sure. So you want to make sure an investor is protected. You want to make sure that transparency is given. You want to make sure that this and that, and all these things can be done far better by blockchain. But in the end, from my perspective, there has to be someone, for example, to have an eye on what a miner is doing in the end. So nowadays, a miner really equals to a clearing system who basically just gives his approval to a transaction. Technically, it's not really checking the balances, but that's what central security depository does today. So I think a certain amount of regulation has to be in place for market participants, because it will never work out just to leave it in the system and everybody is happy and there is no fraud. And it's kind of it's a difficult topic, and really don't want to defend banks, just say that again, but you got to find someone who is, for example, able to prove that a smart contract is fine and give certainty to investors that they feel comfortable to throw in their Ether or stable coins or whatever it is.
Let me jump in there with an example to show how difficult this actually is to answer. Like, I totally agree. Maybe, you know, this 12-year-old Chinese investor should not buy my security, right? But that seems obvious and funny to all of you, right? But at the same time, let's imagine we have kind of an like on or off-chain relayer network, right? Where we have a little bit more efficient infrastructure. It's a pure technical trustless infrastructure that facilitates a more efficient way for me as, you know, a registered trader and you as a registered trader to move funds. Why would that stuff, right, that the technical infrastructure not stand in, you know, in the bedroom of some miner to do that, right? To exchange that. I mean, we think that exchange of securities is always a trade, right? But it might just be part of some technical infrastructure that does some job. Like today, it would be crazy to say, you know, that the internet backbone or that Swisscom would need a security dealer license, right? Well, Swisscom or the network in Switzerland is moving all our assets around. And what I see is that tomorrow, just as, you know, Swisscom or whoever operates the cable, the copper cable or fiber cables on the ground doesn't need a security dealer license, if we want to move stuff on blockchain around, that's the sort of thing we're looking at. We're looking at infrastructure, and core infrastructure, well, should be treated in just the same way, right?
Right. I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to tie it up here, as much as I'd like to keep going. But that was a very, very useful input, I think, for the audience and me. And I'm sure some people have questions, but we do have to move it to lunch to stay on schedule. But I think you guys are around during lunch, and if anyone has any questions, you can be approached. I want to emphasize again, I've had a lot of conversations with people over the last year, and I think these guys really know their stuff when it comes to securities and looking at tokens as well. So big round of applause for the panelists. Thank you very much.